Tonight we have a special guest. Russell Raines is from Austin. He's an attorney, retired, and he's now the director of the Digital Media Management MBA program at St. Edward's College in Austin. Please welcome Russell Raines. All right, Russell. So this is a relatively new program. I think you indicated this is the second year. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I think we have it on. Thank you. Yeah, I'm about to graduate my first cohort. It's a 2-year program, and you can cut me off anytime I go too far. But it's a 2-year program. It's a business degree. It's an MBA, and what that means is literally you're going to have all of the typical finance, management, accounting courses. But in addition to that, it's a very long degree. It's 54 hours, which is quite a bit.
Yeah,
but in addition to that, you're going to have a large number of specialized courses, digital media management, which ultimately, for the most part, has been entertainment courses.
So digital media management is what?
The theory is, or when we were setting this thing up, and I don't want to go too far afield, but originally we were thinking about having a narrower focus. And what we were looking at was something probably along the lines of Belmont University, an MBA in music business. And I was actually part of this decision. We decided ultimately that might be too narrow. And that's an unusual decision because normally you go to graduate school and the idea is that you dig in. You narrow your focus. And we kind of did it the other way around and kind of exploded it. And rather than just having a focus on music business as an MBA, which already exists in a couple of schools, and they do a good job, we decided to go ahead and explode everything that was entertainment, which will ultimately be digital media, and teach it that way.
So management of digital media enterprises?
Well, yeah, it would include that. I mean, at this point, primarily we look at the music industry, but also film and video, gaming. And the irony is, and I don't know if any of you are from Austin, but most people know of Austin because of its live music, and that's sort of famous for that. On any given night, there are at least 100 venues. We have live entertainment, and it's had a pretty good run as a film capital for that part of the country. There's been a lot of work in Texas in the film industry, and a lot of people hear about that, but the thing that the thing that generates the most money in Austin is the gaming industry. And that's what the powers that be, and there are powers that be, have decided will probably be the future of that part of Texas. And so rather than just have the narrow focus on music or on film or on gaming, we've tried to include all three under one umbrella as digital media.
I see. So it's almost the entertainment business in general.
Yeah, and even broader than that. But yes, it is entertainment, but it's beyond entertainment. Let me give you kind of an example. If you do a Google search on digital media, you're going to come up with a lot of really odd things. You're going to come up with a quote from the chairperson or chairman of SBC, which is now AT&T again, where he comes out, and I think his name's Whitaker, and he's going to come out and he's going to say, we are no longer a telephone company, we are no longer a communication company, we are an entertainment company. And you're seeing that more and more as these industries literally converge, which is what we teach, is the convergence of media. So we can't break it down into small parts completely. We try to teach what are the common denominators, and it's been a real trick to figure out what basically is the common denominator beneath these seemingly different industries.
Well, what are they?
Content and delivery.
Huh.
Ultimately, everything is going to be content and delivery. And there's a scary aspect of that because programs like this, and especially my program, are a solution as much as the creation of the problem, because we begin to forget what it is. And we begin to forget we are dealing with music, we're dealing with expression, and it's special, or music, or film, or gaming. But it's real easy to commoditize this and to think of it literally as only ones and zeros. But that's, I like to say, well, that's not where the industry's going. That's where it is today, right now. So,
where's it going?
I have some worries about where it's going. We teach convergence, and what does that mean? It means a lot of different things. You're seeing convergence of technology, which is part of the delivery aspect of the formula. You're seeing companies converge. In my lifetime, it's been extraordinary to see the number of major labels dwindle to, I think we have 4 now. I can't even tell you that for a fact. It'll probably be 2 in a couple of years. And after that, you know what it's going to be? It's going to be Walmart. Right now, Walmart and I think Target sell 40% of the physical CDs. And that disturbs me. Nothing against Walmart. Well, sure there is. But I'm not going to use this as a bully pulpit to go after poor Sam Walton. But the fact of the matter is, I think it's a scary thing when you have that much content controlled by so few people. And what you will see, you know, I kind of trapped you into asking that question, I think, but what you will see is the possible commoditization of the arts. And there are a lot of people that think that this is favorable, and there are good arguments. I mean, you can read papers, you know, written by reasonably scholarly and knowledgeable people that will espouse the notion of music like water, and that you will pay a utility fee for music. And there are good parts of that, and I recognize that, but there are also some, I think, scary parts to that, too.
Well, I guess the iPod tax is one way to go, right?
Yeah, well, iPod is, you know, this is another one of those situations where you're talking about I think the tail wagging the dog, and it's hard to pin down Steve Jobs, especially recently. And there's been a real, I don't know if what he's actually doing. I take him pretty seriously, though.
Well, I mean, you're talking about he wants to get rid of copy protection, even though he's the biggest user of copy protection.
Yeah, it would work well for him, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And why don't we have free software while we're at it? And why don't we have free computers and free iPods? I don't know. It's hard to see how far you can take that. I mean, when you've made your fortune off of the notion that that you can have intellectual property, and that has the same value as this or as the land that this university is built upon, and that's for real, it's not an abstraction, that's for real, and your entire business structure is premised on intellectual property, but you say, but wait a minute, it works for patents and maybe trademark, but you know, copyright, I don't think so. I think, you know, the people are entitled to share in this, and that's contrary to the entire legal structure that's set up. All of this is a property right, and you may not be interested in that, but I imagine ultimately you are interested in that, because were it not a property right, you don't have music business, period. Am I going too far afield?
No, this is true.
When you look at the advent of the music business and what you're learning, you know, you go before 1790 and you made a living, if you were lucky, if you worked for the church. And if you didn't work for the church, maybe if you're really lucky, like Mozart, you found somebody who was, you know, crazy enough and rich enough to support your lifestyle. But that was it. And you had no possible property rights in anything that you did. And without those property rights, which come directly from copyright, you have no publishing. And without publishing, you have no music business, at least historically. Obviously, that's changing. And that gets back to your real question, is where is it headed? And I don't know. I think there are good arguments. I think there are good arguments to be made that we might see a commoditization of the arts. I think there are good arguments to be made that copyright itself will no longer be the standard. And a lot of people, some pretty erudite people, have actually said, is the copy aspect of copyright fundamental? And this is really crucial, especially for music. But when you're talking about digital media, and you're talking about something that need not ever be physically held in your hand, it's going to be distributed over the internet, it's going to be performed over the internet, copied over the internet. And are these even copies? I mean, they're so perfect, they're more like a clone. So the notion of copy may not even be relevant anymore. So that's what I guess the business will figure out, and it'll be followed by the law, as has always been the case.
Is, you know, there's a dispute with record companies and artists about iTunes. Is it distribution or is it licensing? Because if it's...
You know, I think it's really only pricing when you get right down to it. I don't think that distribution per se is the problem, because especially with the Apple regime, you're still subject to digital rights management. And when you have digital rights management, which is almost a code word for something evil these days, but when you have digital rights management, there's at least some recognition of there being a property right. So I don't think that there's a complete divorce between the two sides. The problem is, though, when you control such a tremendous portion of the market, you can keep the prices artificially low. And the thing is, that's what Walmart has been doing as well. So I mean, pick your opponent.
Digital rights management, you want to talk about that for a second?
In a way, that's what I've been talking about, but it's been kind of disguised as other things. And I almost hate to use the term because it's offensive to a lot of people. But right now, I mean, the record companies and publishers have had really two main approaches to trying to stop the hemorrhaging in their industries. And one is go after the people who are breaking the law, but that's probably most of the people we know. And it just isn't going to work. I mean, you can't do that. They are, you keep reading about the RIAA stepping up lawsuits against students in particular, downloading vast amounts. But those are really random and specialized instances, and they can't be widespread. That's one solution. The only other solution that they've at least embraced so far is the notion of digital rights management, where there's some type of limitation on your use of something that you have theoretically purchased. And then that gets into even a deeper question is, well, what have you purchased and what are your rights, once you have purchased? And then that gets into fair use arguments and it goes on and on. But right now, I mean, that's where it is. And you can trace it back to about 1980, with the advent of the compact disc. And at first, the record companies were just going nuts because it's like, hey, we can sell James Taylor all over again, or the Beatles, or somebody from the 60s. But then this little light goes off in their head, and it's like, well, wait a minute. Every single consumer has a perfect copy. And, okay, well, that's okay. You know why? Because nobody can afford a digital audio tape machine. That's 10 years away from now, so let's just keep on going. Well, guess what? Digital audio tape comes around toward the end of the 80s, and the record companies go nuts because now you can make pretty much a perfect copy of your perfect copy. And they pass a few laws. But you know what? As always, they're looking at the wrong part of the board. Because in the meantime, a new compression format, MP3, comes online, and DAT's no longer relevant, and the record companies begin the bleeding. And finally, they put enough pressure on Congress to adopt, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which also puts us in compliance with the rest of the world. So that's kind of cool. But really what they're trying to do is to triage this thing, which is now bleeding to death at a profound rate. So they only have two choices. Basically, they can either go after each and every one of the people who are downloading, which is a large numbers of of your friends and family, or they can try to come up with digital rights management.
It's hard to criminalize so many people. Must be 50 million people downloading music.
Oh, there's a lot more than that. I think Kazaa, at its peak, it was something like. I don't remember. The program itself had been downloaded 300 million times or something like that. And at any given moment, there were 3 million people. Don't quote me on that. I think that was the number. And of course, ultimately, just like Napster, Aimster, Kazaa, and there's been a lot of the peer-to-peer cases, they all ultimately lose, and they all pay $50 to $100 million to the recording industry. And then they try to make it a legitimate business and generally don't do well.
That's true.
So.
Why do you suppose that most of us look at downloaded music on the internet as not a moral or ethical issue, not even a legal issue?
That's a great question. A lot of surveys that have been conducted demonstrate that people do think of it as a legal issue but still choose to go ahead and do it. I think because it's intangible. If you're going to take my jacket, you're going to have to look me in the eye and take my jacket. But if you're going to take my music, you don't see me, you don't see any injury. It doesn't seem like property. Intuitively to us, dirt seems like property. Personality or chattel, chairs, clothing, that seems like property, but the abstraction of tangible expression, and it's only tangible the moment it's created, and ones and zeros satisfy that legal requirement. It's tangible. So tonight when I have a moment of inspiration after my second beer and I start singing, if I record it, it's tangible for purposes of copyright right then and there, and I could upload it, it's gone into the ether forever, and someone on the other side of the world, they're not going to have any sense of that being anyone's property because it's just so abstract.
So what was the answer, though? I mean, if you could wave a magic wand and change the copyright law, would you do it?
Yes, and that will happen. There are several think tanks that advise Congress on this, one of which I can't recall, but it has written a book called The Digital Dilemma, which is a pretty good book. I require my students to read it. And you can actually read it online for free. It's about 300 pages, but you can, you don't even have to buy it, although it'd be cool if you did. And they actually, talk about policy suggestions that would change copyright law. And there are a lot of ways that it could be done. And there is some evidence to indicate that we're beginning to see an increase in illegal downloading. And so it's possible we've turned the corner. I hope so.
What words would you say to a group of, say, junior high school students that you think would have an impact on their desire to download music?
If I'm larger, I could threaten them. I think that probably has more reality than anything else.
So you can't talk them into it. You can't shame them into it. You can't explain it to them. You can't even educate them.
Just say no to downloading, huh? Nah, it's not going to work. It didn't work before, did it?
Right.
Don't answer. I don't know. That's a good question. I've got one of those students, and she'll be that age soon, and I'll have to ponder that and come back in a couple of years. I don't know. Good question.
It's an interesting problem because there are those that would say that obscurity is the biggest curse of the artist and not piracy.
Well, that's usually what people will say when they're, that's actually been posed in legal cases that have been argued on the merits of downloading, and that you're actually doing a favor, by spreading the word for people who are obscure, who wouldn't otherwise get any kind of recognition, and by downloading the music. And there's a certain amount of truth in that, and a lot of legitimate artists are doing that, and I think there is some benefit. But I think that ultimately that's not a very good argument. I don't think there's any compelling reason once the music's out there to pay the money. And when you have a large number of people who feel ultimately it's not a moral dilemma to do that, I don't think you can't close the door. The door is open. You've got to rethink the door, and we haven't done that yet.
How do you propose for people to distinguish between music that's free on the internet and music that is not free on the internet? I mean, that is illegal to download. Music that's illegal to obtain and music that's legal to obtain. Same format, sometimes the same artist.
Yeah, most of the time.
I mean, in the sense that I can make my music available on the internet, and it is free for you to take. I want you to take it.
Right.
And then in 3 years when I get to be famous, now I want you to pay me for it.
Too late. You can't do it. I mean, that's like, what is that like? It's like something. I can't think of what it's like. Somewhere in the universe of analogies, there's a perfect one. I can't think of what it is. But you can't strike. That's like if you're in a court of law and you say something to the jury and the judge says, strike that, forget that. You can't forget it. And just like you can't take it back. Once you put it out there, you can't then come back and say, okay, you've had your fun, now pay for it. No, it's not going to work.
Do you think Creative Commons is a solution to any of these problems?
I think it is in part. They have 5 or 6 contracts. And I don't know if you're familiar with Creative Commons, but I strongly urge you to go take a look at the website. The contracts are for free. The contracts will fit a variety of situations. They give the authors the opportunity to customize the degree or extent to which they want protection under copyright. One of the things that they allow the author to do is put limitations on their own term. Right now, one of the problems that people are finding with copyright is that it lasts for at least the author's life plus 70 years. And there are a lot of scholars, including Lawrence Lessig at Stanford, who say basically copyright is forever. And he's one of the people who's connected with the Creative Commons, and I think he's right up to a point. There hasn't been a real universal adoption of that. I know David Byrne has adopted it, and a few other people that are reasonably well-known, artists or musicians, but it's still up and coming. I think it's a good start, a very good start, and that you, the author, can determine the extent to which you will allow other people to do mixes of your work or to use them as they see fit, as long as you're given credit. From a philosophical standpoint, what has happened with the Creative Commons model is that they've borrowed heavily from the moral rights model that's used in France and in Europe. And so in this country, our whole tradition tends to go back to the Statute of Anne and the notion of property that comes from England. The French model is really different, and they're more concerned with the notion that the authors be given credit for their work, and that the work not be butchered or bastardized. And so the Creative Commons agreements, which are free for you, are kind of a combination of these two theories, and they're not the same. And I think it's a real good start.
Do you think that you should register your copyright with the Library of Congress before you engage in the Creative Commons licensing process?
That'd be a good idea. You don't have to. Really, ever since the United States became a signatory to the Berne Convention, we did away with the old formalities that in the past you had to literally register a work for protection. And literally, the moment your work becomes, if it's original, becomes tangible, you have a copyright. So theoretically, you need not register it. Now, I always, especially I did mostly copyright law for about 20 years, and so I always tell clients, or always told clients, yeah, do that. You really need to do that to avail yourself of the remedies that are provided, under statute and to go to federal court. But technically, you have a copyright. So yeah, in the best of all worlds, you would register it, and then you could do, and that's an interesting idea, then you could parse it out subject to the Creative Commons license that you think is most appropriate.
Well, if you didn't register it and you did the Creative Commons and somebody violated it, how would you sue them for infringement? How would you?
There are some loopholes that if a certain period of time, I think it's up to 5 years afterwards, you could go back and reverse you could register it after the fact. There are also other theories of, and this gets kind of arcane, but you wouldn't have to just go under a copyright theory. You could go to state court and go under an unfair trade competition, which is basically just saying what they're doing is not fair. So in other words, yes, copyright is the best way to go when someone's taken your intellectual property if it's a copyright. There are a lot of different reasons, but for one, the judge is going to know what you're talking about. Number two, there are already built-in penalties, so you don't have to prove the loss of sales that you could never prove. You can, ask for statutory damages, which are pretty severe in certain cases. But were you to have missed that opportunity and have that 5 years pass, and don't hold me to that 5 years, but it's about 5 years, you could still theoretically seek a remedy in court under common law theories in every state but Louisiana, and I don't know, since this is Napoleonic Code, but there's going to be a parallel to it. You can still go to court and basically just say, hey, what they did is wrong. They took the property. A reasonable person would assume that person created it and I created it. And so there are still ways you can kind of wiggle around it, but that's a tough road to go.
What do you tell your students? I mean, their whole livelihood depends on the protection of digital media, right?
Yes. So
to the extent that it's downloaded illegally or freely, then they have a big problem.
Well, knowledge is always the biggest advantage. And truthfully, you can make an argument that this is the worst possible time for the music industry, but I don't think so. I think it's the best possible time, but we just don't know where it's going to go. But I think it's going to be explosive in the future. I think digital delivery is a godsend. I think this is great. I just don't know how the business is going to actually survive in its current form. Well, it's not going to survive in its current form. That's a fact, and that may not be such a bad thing. It's a bad thing if you're, the president of Acuff Rose, but it may not be a bad thing for those of you now who are learning this stuff, and you can see how it was done in the past and what worked and what didn't work, and then anticipate, hopefully the future. So I'm not at all disturbed by this, but you have to be aware of it. And if you stay with the music business and don't go to any other thing, that's fine. But I urge you. Stay up on the technology, stay up on the business end of it. There are a lot of digital daily news services where you can every day, just in 5 minutes, look at the headlines, and they're usually categorized by digital technology, by digital law, digital business, and be conversant in it. And if you are, you'll weather the storm and you'll surf the wave and not be, drowned by it.
Tell me about video games. If I play a video game and film the screen of my game, my performance of that game, can I put that on the internet?
Is it your game?
No.
No, you cannot.
So
because a video game is going to have the same copyright protections, and that would be a performance.
But don't video game makers encourage you to do that?
I think some of them do, and obviously, it depends. When you say video games, there are about 4 different formats, from just home computers to consoles to really what we're seeing more and more, and it's starting in the Far East, in particular Korea, are these massive multiplayer online games. where you pay a certain amount, maybe $10 subscription a month, and you get on, and these people, they become avatars, and it's almost an alternative reality situation. I think some of them get kind of eaten up in the head, and some of them are my students. So anyway, hopefully they'll pull themselves out long enough to make $1 million and send it back to university and go back and make more games. But in that situation, I would assume, and it just depends. I mean, when you turn the thing on or you get into it, there's going to be some kind of licensing or restrictions, and each one's going to be different. But in the hypothetical that you posed, I would assume that would be unless there's something that says, yeah, you can go do this, I would assume that, yes, that's a performance. If you don't have permission, it's a copyright violation.
Can a copyright holder give you permission to use it freely on some days and not on others?
No, but you, in a way, you've already hit that from a different way. Hopefully this is a situation where you may have a Creative Commons license, and they would say, hey, you can do whatever you want to. In fact, here's, you can even go back and work on the source code or what's the other one? And do whatever you want to. It's an open source situation, but you can't do the following things. You can't go out and use these characters in another setting and make derivatives. In other words, if there's a character that's part of the game, I'm not authorizing you or in any way assigning to you the right to now go out and make a cartoon or a T-shirt or a movie based upon that. So in other words, there are a lot of things that you can do, and especially with the Creative Commons license, that would be a partial, it opens the door and says, yeah, come in and fix this thing, like Wikipedia. It's open. For the most part, it's reasonably reliable. People come in, they tweak it, and they move on. And so I think you're going to see that more and more with games and gaming, but there will be certain limitations. They're not going to allow you to take property that is original and then go out and make another derivation and then make money on it. So,
how do you explain to maybe a younger person who can get into a car and turn on a device and music comes out freely? They go into their house and turn on another device and music comes out freely, but that's illegal.
That's a good one. A lot of times control. And we're seeing this be one of the ultimate issues with digital transmission when they're trying to determine, especially with satellite broadcasts, if you actually are a subscriber, does that give you the right to control what you're hearing, or is it going to be random, more like an old radio station? So the answer to your question actually has been, at this point they're arguing over it, and the answer is control, the extent to which you have control.
So if you have control, then you have a legal obligation.
Yes, and then that would put you in the subscription regime. And that's a good thing, because one of the changes that has been pretty recent that you've probably learned about in class is the fact that we now have a 6th exclusive copyright right, for lack of a better word. And what it does, which never happened in the past, is it generates really performance royalties for sound recordings that are digitally transmitted. Now, as you know probably from your classes historically, if you hear, you turn on the radio in your car and you hear a song by some artist, somebody somewhere is theoretically, and it's going to be the publisher, is going to receive performing, some subject to an ASCAP or BMI blanket license, more than likely, some sort of performance royalty. And maybe, the artist is if they own a piece of the publishing, but if the artist is a person who does covers, they're not going to get any of that. And the record company or the producer, who typically own the sound recording, because they financed it, they're not going to get any of that. Now in Europe, yes, they will. But for years, the RIAA and others have lobbied Congress, we want sound recording owners, which would be the record company and producers, to, receive some of the flow of money from the performance of, from the broadcast, really, of their works. Well, Congress kind of went partway with this, and in the 90s, part of the DMCA actually did recognize that digitally transmitted sound recordings will create that royalty. So we're partway there. I forgot the question.
But you've answered it, I think.
I hope so.
So if the sound recording copyright owners get paid for the performance of that sound recording, that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
There was no.
If it's a digitally transmitted.
Right. That's in the new law.
Yes.
Now, so tell me about the rights that they've acquired from the artist. If the right is a work for hire, it's a different right than if it's a purchase of a copyright.
Yeah, that's a really good distinction. Typically, the record company they're going to do two things. They want the publishing. They want their publishing arm to get the publishing, and they're going to negotiate on that. But they're not going to give it to you until you ask for it. And hopefully you keep your publishing, and there are a lot of good reasons to do that. And the second thing they're going to do is you're going to enter into, if you're the artist, into an employment contract. And it's called a royalty artist agreement, but you work for the record company. And one of the things that's nailing down is the fact it's not a work made for hire per se, although sometimes they will actually have that language, which should make you fearful. But typically there'll be some kind of language to the effect that you're assigning any and all rights, whatever they may be. And it may be a work made for hire to the sound recording based upon the notion that the record company and or producer are actually the ones that are financing it. That's the argument. Keep your publishing. You can get rich in 20 years when people do covers of your songs, but we're ponying up $250,000. We're paying for the actual production, and we want the ownership to that particular performance embodied in the sound recording. And that has always been the argument for a very long time. Really, truthfully, that goes back to the 50s when you started to have rock and roll artists actually own their own publishing, which was unusual. Prior to that time, the Frank Sinatras of the world, they didn't write songs. And so they weren't even part of this whole equation. They got paid, some small royalty on the sale of units, and that's it. They got no publishing. They had no clout whatsoever to negotiate for the sound recording because they didn't own the music itself anyway. But then with, the 50s and the rock and roll and later the 60s, and, you started having the popular creators of music were also the people who, by and large, wrote the music, and then things got really interesting. And one of the things the record companies attempted, and really for the most part, kept for themselves was ownership of these sound recordings, for which they would not receive performance royalties in the traditional United States, venues for performance, including radio and such.
Well, how does that affect the right to retrieve your publishing? After 35 years, you can notify the copyright holder. Now, how does that apply to the recording, the sound recording?
That's a wonderful question, and that applies if it's not a work made for hire,
right.
Which I think you're trying to steer me toward.
Right.
Thank you. If you do enter into the work made for hire agreement, under the law, you never owned it, so there's never a possibility that this can come back or revert to you. And what he's talking about is in the situation where you simply assign it, which is normally the case, which means to legally transfer whatever rights you have, there is the opportunity between the 35th and 40th year to actually, in effect, have these rights revert back to you.
So in 2013, there's going to be a lawsuit.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of them probably.
Because that's the 35 years after the passage of the 1978 Act that created this.
Yes. Well, what a lot of the more cynical scholars, Lawrence Lessig and others, are saying is that at that point in time, they'll probably just go ahead and extend it again. It's been extended something like 14 times, and don't quote me on that number, but it's some incredible number. And so when you look back at the original Copyright Act that set all this stuff up, it was a 14-year term. And it didn't include music, by the way. Music didn't come until a couple of decades later, and you go back to 1790 when they started all of this. And eventually it included music, and then in fine art and sculptures, and then it would go sculptures. Then it would go to things like performance as a result of the creation of the player piano, and that created mechanical rights, and then they redid it in 1909 and so on. Each time they made these revisions, they keep expanding the term. 14 years, then 14 plus 14, then 28, then 28 plus 28, then 28 plus 28 plus 19, then 50 plus life, then 70 plus life. And those are the ones off the top of my head, and there have been some increments in between. And so the cynic will say that, at the expiration of 35 years from January 1st, 1978, which is when the 76 Act actually came into effect, then at that point, the Disneys of the world who do not want to lose Mickey Mouse are going to put enough pressure on copyright to extend it once again, and there's a pretty compelling argument that they'll do it.
Why shouldn't copyright be perpetual?
Well, because the Constitution says it shouldn't be. The entire policy of the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, that talks about this, that creates all intellectual property in this country, is premised on the notion that for a finite period of time, authors and inventors of the creative and useful arts and sciences will be granted a monopoly on their works, be it an invention, a trademark, or a copyright. But this is balanced against the notion that we, the people of the United States, have the right to use this if we jump through the proper hoops. One of those hoops is pay a royalty. And so this is an absolute fundamental constitutional policy. And if you have a perpetual copyright, you've basically killed the notion that anything could ever become part of the public domain, and therefore that's unconstitutional. I mean, that's in its essence, contrary to the intention of the people who set this up.
Which, of course, is because the answer I get, I mean, the reason I suppose is because it's not a positive development for society, a free and open society.
I think it's horrible, yeah. I mean, if it were to go forever, and I'm not sure life plus 70 is fair either.
Well, that is a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a real problem.
And when it was extended, didn't the dissenting opinion in that case talk about there was the stuff that was covered by the extension, only 2% was available to the public?
I don't recall that, but do you happen to recall who actually said that?
I think it was Potter Stewart.
I don't recall that. That sounds probably pretty persuasive to me. And then the majority are going to say it is our obligation to be in step with the rest of the civilized world, and this is what Europe has done, and Buenos Aires Convention, and we need to be in harmony. So
everything is based on something else, though, right?
Yeah. I mean, music business is based upon publishing. Publishing is based upon copyright. Copyright is based upon law. Law is based upon precedent. So the whole notion is that there is a rule of law, which is the foundation of your business, believe it or not, and it can go back, and we can go back and trace it about 1,000 years to England for most of the United States. It's based on English common law. And the reason that this is important and not a bunch of just words is it gives us consistency. We can predict what courts will do looking at stare decisis, which is a policy whereby one court is more or less obligated to, in a similar setting, follow what a previous court did. That's why, for example, commerce in the former Soviet Union is just berserk right now because they do not have a rule of law. They can't go back a couple hundred years and say, every time this has happened before, the courts will do this. That's a real important notion. I mean, you want law to be predictable. And so if it isn't, it kills business.
It seems like that would be an important development to have is predictable laws.
Yeah.
But that's what we don't have right now. Copyright law is almost in the eyes of the beholder, isn't it?
No, the law is very clear.
How you interpret it, though.
The end users are interpreting it, but I don't even really think I would go go that far. I think most of the people who are doing it know ultimately that they're violating the law and they've chosen for whatever reason not to follow it. At least that's what the anecdotal evidence seems to indicate.
Well, there's sure a lot of downloading, file sharing going on.
A lot of people smoke marijuana. It's the law, and not to. So
is that illegal? Y'all know?
You can edit that, right? I don't know. Let's see.
Copyright law.
Mouth's a little dry.
Yeah. So, does anybody have any questions of our guests?
Thanks, you've been great. Bye-bye.
You danced around it a little bit, and I know you mentioned it a little bit with the Steve Jobs thing. Do you think an amendment to the Constitution doing away with copyright would be possible in the future as an alternative solution to this sort of Walmart model, syndicating all copyright?
No, I don't. I think an amendment to it, conceivably that I'm kind of radical. I mean, I can actually embrace the notion that copy may not really be the threshold issue of copyright. I mean, that's a pretty bizarre thought. But no, I think people, by and large, two types of people that create. And one, they just have to, and they're going to do it no matter what. And then the others are doing it because there's incentive. You write code, you get paid for it. You write a killer hit, you get money, hopefully. And I think ultimately our culture is such that most people want to be rewarded for that. And I don't think that we will, as a people, embrace something so radical as killing copyright. I think it's counterproductive. I do think that there will be an amendment, not to the Constitution, but to Title 17 United States Code, the Copyright Act itself. And it might be something so outrageous as changing the whole threshold issue. There are some law review articles that have gone down that road that are pretty easy to find, and it's worth reading. That didn't answer your question. It's the best I can do.
You mentioned some Washington think tanks that talk about copyright policy and changing it. What are some concrete examples of ways that they want to change beside what Creative Commons is doing?
That's a great question. And in a way, one of those ideas really is the notion of doing away with copy as the threshold issue. The reality is that, when you look at copyright, and traditionally it created 5 exclusive rights, and those rights gave rise to industries. If you didn't have the right to control copying, you wouldn't have the publishing. If you didn't have the right to control performance, you wouldn't have ASCAP BMI. And if you didn't have the right to control distribution, you wouldn't have the Harry Fox Agency issuing mechanical licenses, and on and on and on. With the internet, where content and delivery are becoming one and the same, ultimately, it seems likely that you will see changes to how we perceive those distinctions because they're no longer really there. A performance and a delivery and a distribution, they're all the same thing when it's ones and zeros. So I think that that has been one of the predicate arguments for an amendment would be that we need to go back and revamp the whole 5 exclusive rights, including the notion that copying is the basis of copyright protection. Because what are you copying when you're doing something that's all ones and zeros? You're not really copying. I mean, this isn't a copy. It's more akin to literally a clone. It's identical literally. It's the same. It lasts pretty much forever. So, I mean, a copy by its nature suggests, somehow a replication based upon an original, but that can be distinguished from the original, and that's not the case now. So that would be one of the notions. I'll try to get back to you with the rest of them and see if I can, while I'm answering another question, go back and access the Digital Dilemma book that I made reference to, because they lay it out pretty clearly. And if I don't come back to you and there's a real possibility, then come up here and I'll give you a card and you email me and I'll send you the link.
When you're buying a CD, what are you buying?
The sound recording, that's it. You're buying the embodiment of that one performance.
What rights do you get?
Well, that's the question. I'm also, in my mind, buying the right subject to the digital rights management, and I buy it pursuant to whatever digital rights management I'm being offered. Assuming that it doesn't violate the digital rights management, I also have the right to make a very limited number of copies for my personal use. And that's it. That's what I get. If I give it to you, I've broken the law.
Huh, really?
Yeah. Nobody follows that. But really, that you have, and there's actually case law to this effect somewhere, and you'll read different answers to this question if you go to the ASCAP or BMI websites, which are excellent, by the way, and also go to the United States Copyright website. Wonderful stuff there, but it's free. But when you buy that, subject to the digital rights management, and that's the thing, you own that sound recording. You can sell it to someone else. You can give that to someone else. You can make copies for your personal use. You can't make a copy for you. You're my friend. Here, have a copy. You don't have that right. You're not buying that.
If it's illegal for me to give you a CD that I bought, right?
No, it's illegal for you to make a copy and give me the copy.
I can give you the CD.
You can give me the CD.
If I give you a copy, I can make a copy and keep it for myself.
That's a pretty good argument. And give the original. Wow. There's something about that makes me uncomfortable.
Well, see,
you could do it.
This is the problem.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
The laws are...
Yeah, they are.
Some part of the law does makes no sense, and people are not going to obey
Well, they
laws.
haven't. They haven't. I mean, you're exactly right. But yeah, you're entitled to make a copy subject to any kind of digital rights management, and then you could give the original, which you bought and paid for, to me as your friend.
I can resell the original?
If you're keeping another copy, that kind of fogs
What if
it up
I
a
wasn't?
little bit. Yeah, you can resell it. Yeah.
What if I go to a concert and tape the concert, and it's Dave Matthews, and he says it's okay, or the Grateful Dead, or whoever, and then can I put that on the internet?
He says it's okay to copy it, or he says it's okay to distribute and perform it. See, that's the problem. What is he saying okay to? Okay to copy is one of the 5 or 6 rights.
Right.
For personal use, yeah, go record it, go home and listen to it. When you put it up on the internet, now you've got a problem. Is does that constitute a performance or a distribution? And arguably yes, but the fact that there's no tangible copy other than ones and zeros makes it legally questionable. If he says that you can copy it, that does not mean that you can distribute and perform it. That's what the whole amendment to the Copyright Act in 1976 and enacted in 78, That's what they did. They broke apart the bundle of rights. Prior to that time, when you transferred a copyright, it was everything. And at that point in time, they said, no, you can keep the performance and distribution and parcel out this. And that doesn't sound like a very good deal, but it's a wonderful deal. If you want to keep everything but the adaptation rights and let someone make a translation or a derivative copy and translate it into a foreign language or something, great, get more money. Yes, sir?
Whose responsibility is it to enforce copyright law? Theoretically, who should enforce it? Practically, who doesn't enforce it? And ideally, how you think it should be in the future?
Publisher. I mean, assuming that you have a publisher, you have a contractual relationship with a bona fide, legitimate publisher. That's one of the things they do. They exploit the work and they protect the work. They get out there and they get recordings and covers and get it placed on TV and movies and films and elevators. And when somebody trespasses on your property, it's their obligation under the contract to enforce it, which means hire counsel. So that's what they do, and that's why they get what they get, theoretically.
On a case-by-case basis, for instance, file sharing, is that really practical for publishers to go out?
No, it's not, and that's why the publishers and recording industry have lobbying groups and industry groups who can do that collectively. That's why you typically don't have too many labels going after individuals. It's the RIAA, for example. So they have these trade organizations, which would be the collective, strength of all of the member constituents, who then can have the muscle to go after them.
So do you see the federal government taking more of a role in enforcement of copyright law in the future?
No, none whatsoever. Not unless it actually becomes a piracy issue, and then you have a criminal aspect of it, and then they're required to come on board. I don't want them involved. The law is the law, and that's fine, and let the courts interpret it. But I don't want the government enforced. No. I am not opposed to the notion that some uses do rise to the level of being a criminal sanction, and that's a reasonably big deal under the DMCA, which has basically been created to go after piracy. It's not one or two people in a college dorm room downloading. This is gigantic companies, doing huge amounts of work, and I mean that is criminal, and I'm glad that there is that, and that would be the very limited extent to which I would want to see the government involved in enforcement. That's because they're the only ones who can go after criminals. You and I have to, we're limited to civil remedies. A lot of people say that the record industry killed itself. Millions of different ways. The classic example is the container charge, that is taken away from the artist royalties right off the top, usually 20 to 25% allegedly to repay the recording industry for the research and development of what later became the compact disc, but it's all nonsense. And charging $17 or $18 for something that's worth about $1 is just it's absurd. And they have paid for that gluttony. To me, I tend to have a problem with the 89 or 99 cent or 79 cent model per single or per cut, just because it's hard for me to see how, from a business model, that makes sense. A few people out there will certainly still make a very good living, but for the most part, it doesn't seem to present a good business model. And the recording industry is really desperately trying to figure out a way to gradually raise that price, but with Jobs digging in and getting more and more of this market share, and with Walmart trying to be Jobs, you're not going to get it up. Most of the measures, if you read an article in Variety, for example, that talks about this, and it talks about the decrease in albums, and I have, in fact, a copy of an article from that with me. They talk about 10 cuts being an album. So it would be if we follow that, then theoretically, what, 89 or $8.90 would be a CD, an album's worth of material. But my premise is that I'm not sure that's a real good business model unless you're Steve Jobs and you have such a vast control over the market. The adage is that publishing is a business of pennies. But we're really cutting it pretty close. And it's hard to see how anyone else who's not a manufacturer of the key distributor is going to come out okay on this deal. I think the prices are artificially low. It's just my opinion. I have a bias, though, and of course my age is another factor, too. Also, I'm a musician. I'm a trained musician. I have degrees in music. I perform music. I recorded. I've toured. So my bias and my clients were primarily musicians. So I'm always going to try to see it from their point of view, and I just don't see how my former clients can make much money out of the deal.
It seems to me that people are copying not because because of the desire to break the law or not because of convenience, much like CDs
Mm-hmm.
have taken over phonograph records for convenience. So it seems like the industry needs to find a way to make it more convenient to pay for it. It's not the actual money.
Yeah, and that argument's been posed for over 30 years since the Sony Betamax case and the whole notion of time shifting and space shifting. And that's what that was. It was a convenience argument, and it holds some water. You know, when all this originally came up, it really started more in the video arena before music. And the case, the seminal case was the Sony case, and I think that was late 70s. It might have been decided finally in the early 80s, in which they said, yeah, you can make copies of TV shows for your own purposes, and the whole idea of time shifting and space shifting. Now, Napster comes back 20 years later, makes the same argument, and they say, no, it's not the same, and here's why, and they had a bunch of distinctions. But they're making the argument you're talking about with the convenience.
I think Steve Jobs was saying that his argument was that 90% of the sales are in discs, and only 10% are digital. So for the 90%, the record company is not controlling your copying and distribution, although legally there's a right. So his argument is, if their record companies are selling 90% of it in a duplicatable form, why should we be penalized for the other 10%?
Well, his numbers are not accurate. And I actually have those numbers with me. If you want me to fetch it, I'll tell you. It's more. I'm sorry, excuse me.
I'm sorry, I read in 2006 that 10% of global record sales were digital, roughly $2 billion.
That might be right. His other, but that can't really follow, because the numbers that I have, in fact, looked at earlier today, related to another matter, indicated more like 42 to 46%, and it was down 7% from 2 years ago. And then there was another category which included Walmart and Target as alternative distribution. Here is the numbers that I was checking out earlier. See if I can find the part that seemed relevant to what you're talking about. Chain stores saw just 41% of all sales, down from 48% 2 years ago. Indie music stores account for 6%. Non-traditional merchants, online services, TVs, kiosks at concert venues saw their sales grow 44% to 69.3 million. Mass merchant outlets like Walmart and Target account for 40% of all sales, up 1%. And then it talks about album sales dropping for the 7th consecutive year, but a dramatic increase in the dramatic increase in the sale of digital tracks helped keep the music industry afloat in 2006. 588.2 million albums were sold last year, down 4.9, but consumers purchased 581.9 million digital tracks. So, I mean, that's 588, million albums versus, down 4.9 versus 581.9 million digital tracks, a 65% increase. I've seen all these numbers. I don't know what they mean. I don't know how reliable they are. Certainly, traditional distribution is dead. And it's hard for me to see how it could be much more convenient than it is right now. But that's the argument that they've been making, your argument.
I have a question about sampling. What can you sample?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I taught at a law school for about 10 years, and beginning in the early 90s. And it looked like sampling was dead. It's like the Gilbert O'Sullivan case begins with the words, "Thou shalt not steal," and everybody just went, "What?" A federal court basically getting all biblical. It's like, Quentin Tarantino movie. It's just like way over the top crazy. And basically what happened is it put the fear of God in people, and for the most part they went out and got licenses. I literally quit teaching digital sampling. It's like, well, that's there's the case, and everybody else had the common sense to settle before that. And there were cases, that were reasonably high profile, but they all went away, and especially after that particular case, which involved the Gilbert O'Sullivan smash hit "Alone Again Naturally," which if you ever have the opportunity to avoid hearing, take it. But anyway, why someone would want to sample it. Okay, so it was dead for a long, long time, right? Well, recently, in a different context, we're seeing digital sampling become a brand new legal issue. And what we're seeing is in the context of film. And we're seeing people who have been licensing, for example, the publishing the actual music itself, but not licensing digitally, getting a digital sample license for the sound recording. And so, you're having fragments looped in the film, and the film, is basically on its face a copyright violation. It goes to court, and these are big cases. And so you're now having digital sampling revisited by the courts, especially in the Ninth Circuit, which is California, which is where the film industry is. And there's some new law on this, and so we're having to rethink that. And it's not what we always thought in the past. And this is actually a cool thing because they're beginning to, it's going to force ultimately the issue to go to the United States Supreme Court, which is what happens when two circuits disagree, and they will disagree, especially the one in Tennessee and the one in California. And the Supreme Court's going to go, well, here's what the law is, but you know what? This is for Congress to figure out. They're going to kick it over to Congress, and then they're going to have to grapple and do a better job patching up the digital problems with copyright.
All right, then. So we have stay tuned, right?
Yeah, I'll be back in a year, and we'll see what happens.
Well, so I think we've reached our time limit here, so please thank our guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you.